So, the last few days, I've been pondering the question of what is the difference between being quiet and being still. And part of this was because I was thinking about what does it mean to express myself fully, and how do I know if I've expressed myself fully or if I'm dwelling or ruminating on the particular issue? Because that can be really easy. We tend to have three different options when an issue comes up, a major situation. One is we just pretend it doesn't exist and we suppress whatever we're going through. The other extreme is we allow that situation to consume us in such a way that we just can't not stop talking about it, and we just continue to dwell and dwell and dwell on it. Well, the healthy area where I think we all would say this is what we should strive for is how do we express it and be fully known without allowing it to consume us? And we would ask it that way because we want to be consumed by Jesus, not by our situations or our circumstances. But just because we're consumed by Jesus doesn't mean we don't have difficulties. And we don't want to suppress that because that's just pretending everything's okay when it's not. But we also don't want to be controlled or manipulated by our circumstances. And so that led me to the question, what is the difference between being quiet and being still? Now, there may be an instance, I'm not familiar with one, where Scripture says be quiet. But I know there are scriptures where it says be still. And there's a difference there. Be still and know that I am God. That is what is happening. That's what Jesus calls us to. And that's where Job eventually gets to. But before he can be still, he allows himself to be fully known. He doesn't pretend everything is okay. He's not trying to put up a false facade. He is expressing himself. But today we're going to get to a point where Job is finally able to be still. And that's a transforming moment for Job. And we find this in Job's last words. Job chapter 27 to 31 is where we find Job's last words. Now remember, chapters 1 and 2, God has identified Job as blameless. But the examiner, or Satan, comes up to God, and God says, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him. And in chapter 1, the examiner says, well, he's the wealthiest man in the world. You've given him everything. Of course he loves you. God allowed the examiner to take everything away from him. All of his possessions were either stolen or destroyed. All 10 of his kids were killed, and Job was left with nothing. Then in chapter 2, the examiner comes back to God, and God says, if you consider my servant Job, identifies him as blameless again. And the examiner said, well, you didn't let me touch him. Didn't let me hurt his physical body. And God said, okay, do whatever you want, just don't kill him. So the examiner inflicted Job with terrible sores and boils. He was in ashes. His wife had abandoned him. He had nothing left. And the question at stake in chapters 1 and 2 is, will Job curse God or will Job bless God? And in chapters 3, all the way here to 26, we see back and forth with Job and his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. One speaks, then Job speaks. One speaks, then Job speaks. Back and forth for those chapters. And then we get to chapter 27 to 31, and Job is able to share his final words. And in chapter 27, he starts off with integrity. He vows to maintain his integrity because he is innocent, which is a really bold claim to make. But he can make that because we've read chapters 1 and 2 where God has identified Job as blameless. If I was to get up here and say, I am blameless, I have done nothing wrong, then we might question, you might question me. But we don't question Job because God has already identified Job as blameless. But in this context where Job lived, it wasn't enough just to claim innocent. It wasn't innocent until proven guilty society. He had to prove that he was innocent. And so he had accusations against him by his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And Job does make the statement that if they are not careful, then they would be deserving of God's wrath, that they say Job is getting. Because Job says when God vindicates him, when Job is vindicated, his enemies will be called to an account. And his friends are not acting like friends, they're acting like enemies. They're judging him, they're condemning him, they're heaping piles of mud on Job. But then we get to chapter 28, and chapter 28 is a really fascinating chapter. It has a lot of imagery to it because Job talks about the search for wisdom. And he uses how we as humanity search for things in this world. It's a poem about how we find wisdom, that we as people are willing to go down to deep places to mine for precious material. And he talks about gold and those types of things. But even today, we could include that to be things like oil that we search for. But these deep recesses in the earth do not provide wisdom. They don't contain wisdom. You can go to the most difficult place ever to get to, but you still will not find wisdom. Wisdom is not found in the sea. Wisdom is not a treasure that can be bought. Wisdom is only found in God. And so in this moment, in chapter 28, we begin to see a shift in the book. It doesn't really fully culminate until chapter 31, but we see this shift. Up until this point, Job has been going down into the depths, going into the deepness, descending into the dark valley. But we see he's no longer going down. He's no longer descending. He's at minimum going level, getting ready to rise out the other side. God is leading him this way. And God is drawing Job to something new. One of Job's difficulties is that he feels as though God has not been present, that God hasn't shown up, that he is left and abandoned to his own devices. But when we see these types of shifts, we see that God is directing Job. He is guiding him to where Job needs to be. But Job keeps coming back to this concept in chapter 28 of you can't mine wisdom. You see, once you mine something like precious stones, or even our day, oil as well, you have to refine it. You have to purify it. You have to get rid of the contaminants. But if we as humanity work so hard to mine things like gold and precious metals and other resources, why don't we work that hard to obtain wisdom? Why don't we seek wisdom with that same veracity as we do the things of this world? You can't buy wisdom. Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, had knowledge, but they lacked wisdom. They were intellectually sharp. They knew their stuff. They were well read. They had all the answers. They could have a debate, but they didn't have wisdom. They had information, but they didn't have wisdom. And partially, it's because of where wisdom derives. Wisdom does not come from my ability to obtain knowledge. Wisdom comes from something deeper. And in Proverbs chapter 20, Proverbs 9, chapter 10, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That is where wisdom starts. If you don't have that, then you don't have wisdom. You may say things that are wise, but without the fear of the Lord, you do not have wisdom. We have to ask ourselves, what is fear of the Lord? Is fear of the Lord just being scared that God is going to smite me? Is it being terrified that God is going to do something to inflict pain on me? No, that's not fear of the Lord. We fear God because he is capable and able of doing those things, but we also trust him. We trust that he is good. Fear of the Lord is not a fear that paralyzes us. It's a loving reverence for God, for who he is, for what he says, and what he does. It's more so than just respect, but that's part of it. God is the Almighty, who is capable of doing all things, but because he loves us, he doesn't. Because he loves us, he doesn't harm us. He doesn't destroy us. That is who God is. And the first step in wisdom is having loving, reverent, and respect for God. Now, one of the conclusions that Job comes to in chapter 28, or that we can draw from, is that Job does not know the answers to the riddles of life. He doesn't know why he's suffering. That is one of his biggest issues. He's struggling. Why would God allow this? Why am I enduring this? Job doesn't know the answers, but he believes that God does. He doesn't know that he is at the center of a cosmic battle. Will Job curse God or will Job bless God? He doesn't know that context like we do, but he trusts that God does. But in chapter 29, Job then shifts to talking about what I refer to as the good old days. Talks about those times where he was prosperous, where people respected him, where he had things that were meaningful to him. Now, if I say the good old days, some of you have thoughts in your mind of what that looks like. You may have a period in your life where say, man, those are just some great days. Maybe you're going through it right now. It's really hard to know that you're going through the good old days when you're going through it, but that's another topic for a conversation. But when we think about the good old days, one of the things we have to be careful of is we want to make sure we're not tied down to the past. I've heard it said that the past can be a good rudder, but not a good anchor. The past is not to hold us back. We can use the past to set a trajectory to see where we should go, but we don't allow the past to keep us there. God is moving us forward according to his purposes. And so Job is talking about the good old days where he had a good reputation, where people respected him, where he helped others, and they just had great camaraderie. He's longing for those days. But in chapter 30, he has self-awareness because he identifies the harsh reality. His life radically shifted. Remember, Job was the wealthiest man in the world. He had all sorts of material possessions. He had family. He has identified himself as having influence in the community. People respected him. But then everything was taken away. And everyone abandoned him. Job was a leader, he was a counselor, he was a friend. He was now abused and forgotten. Job, he loved, he trusted, but now he feels abandoned. He feels like God has left him, that God is not there. But yet he is self-aware. He had to face the harsh reality that he was no longer respected. He was now mocked. People looked at him with pity. We can look in our world today and we can see how there are certain individuals who used to be at the mountaintop and they fell really hard. And really they're forgotten. Sometimes we think of them with pity. And say, man, if this person wouldn't have done that, think of the influence they would have had. And oftentimes it's that they fell from grace because of some action on their part, or they got caught on doing something they shouldn't have done. But that's how Job, that's his life right now. But yet he didn't do anything to deserve it. He didn't get caught doing anything wrong. He didn't have any motives that were questioned. There was nothing about him that would say he deserves this. But yet that's where he was, and he recognized it. I think part of his harsh reality is that he realized that many of the people that he had a relationship with only had a relationship with him because they wanted something from him. It's really hard. And we have certain relationships that are transactional, that someone gets something from you, and that's fine. But that seems to be how everyone was with Job. Because he was the wealthiest. People only wanted what they could get from him. Their friendship was fickle at best. And in the midst of this, Job wonders why God won't answer. Why is God not showing up? Why is God not coming to Job to meet with him in his distress? Because Job has no one to help him. His friends came at the end of chapter 2. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar came and sat with him for 7 days in silence. And we're like, what great friends. But then chapter 3 to 26, we see they just keep ridiculing him. They're telling him that he's getting what he deserves. Two of them even blame the fact, Job told Job that he sinned, but God didn't judge Job for his sin. He killed his kids because Job sinned. What a terrible thing to say. That's the support system that Job has right now. He has no one to help him. No one is willing to be there. Now, this has made me come to the question of, what is my motivation for serving others? What is your motivation for serving others? Sometimes we can serve people and have selfish motives. I serve so I get this. I serve so I can get in this situation. I serve because I benefit. But Mark chapter 10 tells us Jesus came. He tells us the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. That's what Jesus did. He lived a life of service, and he calls us to do the same. We serve because Jesus serves us. We serve because Jesus calls us to serve others, not because we get something from them. Now, Job is a long time before Jesus, I get that. But we're able to see Job and Jesus from our perspective. And we can learn from what Jesus is calling us to do through Job's situation. But the reality is that Job had no value in society. Because he could not give anything to anyone, people had disregarded Job. They had discarded him and thrown him away. That's a harsh reality of our world. Our world tells us that when you can no longer produce something of value, then you no longer have value. And because of Jesus, that's not how we function. Because of Jesus, we recognize we have value because Jesus has identified us as valuable. He has imparted value in us, not because of us, but because of him. So my value is not in what I can produce or what I can provide. My value is just in who Jesus is. But in chapter 31, we find that Job comes to understanding. He is essentially mounting his final defense. Up to this point, Job has requested several times for an audience with God. He wanted an arbiter. He wanted somebody to mediate between him and God, someone to referee, someone to be the judge. If Job had sinned, he was willing to take accountability for those actions. If he had not sinned, he wanted to be proven innocent. He wants a judgment. He asked for judgment so that God can prove Job guilty or for Job to be vindicated. If Job's guilty, he will accept it. If he's not, he wants it to be known. And again, we've seen chapters 1 and 2. We've read those where God has identified Job as blameless. So he would be vindicated. But it's Job's last attempt to understand God's reason. Why would God allow this? Why would Job have to go through this? Now, if you read Job's words throughout his discourse with his friends, and then when he gets to this place, you can notice that his theology is deepening. It's broadening. His understanding of who God is gaining more and more depth. Now, sometimes that can be hard to see because his friends were very shallow to begin with. His friends were not people you wanted to emulate. They had partial truths, but they neglected a lot of things for their own convenience. But Job's depth has grown tremendously. Now, in chapter 31, he identifies 3 different temptations that he says he's avoided. He's avoided lust. He's avoided deceit. He's avoided adultery. And for whatever reason, he picks those 3 things. It says, I have not given in to those particular temptations. Now, you can think of someone with his wealth, with his power, could easily exploit things for his personal benefit and pleasure. But he claims to be righteous. And part of his claim to be righteous is that he has treated people correctly. He has treated people with dignity, with respect. He talked about he's treated his servants and his workers. He treated them right. He was generous to them. He was kind to them. Job talks about how he helped his neighbor. He was there when his neighbors needed them. He helped the poor and cared for them. He was not someone who boasted, but he is defending his reputation. He is seeking vindication. Job has done what is right. He believes that he's done what is right, and he wants it to be known that he is not being punished for sins because that's not the life he lived. Now, that's not how our world functions. So our world needs something like the EPA to make sure that we take care of our environment. Our world needs something like unions to make sure people get fair pay. Wouldn't the world be a lot better place if we didn't need accountability like that? And I'm not trying to bash the unions or the EPA, because if people would do what is right, we wouldn't need those things. But that's the world we live in. We live in a world where people are selfish, where people are mean, where people are cruel, where people will do everything they can for their personal benefit. But that's not what Job did. That's not how he lived. That's not the life that he lived. He did what was right and he respected others. He worshiped God above all else. And he identifies that his security was not in his earthly material possessions. That's what chapter 1 was all about. Job had all the wealth in the world, and the examiner said, well, of course he blesses God. He has everything. But even when you took all that away, Job still blessed God. Job's security was not in the possessions he had. It was in his relationship with God. He didn't understand what God was doing, but he did understand and affirm that God is good and that God loves. And that's something his friends did not do. His friends would emphasize the justice of God. God is just. And so if Job is suffering, that means Job has done something that is unjust. And so God is punishing Job for his sins. It's the prosperity gospel. That's what was happening. That's what his friends were sharing, but that's not who God is, and that's not who Job believed God is. But Job just desperately wanted the opportunity to be heard. We've all been there. Now, I've heard it said that reasonable adults are okay with decisions that go against what they want as long as they feel heard. But I'm sure there are moments where you felt like you weren't heard, where someone made a decision that impacted you and they didn't take you into account. That's frustrating. That's not what God did. But even so, Job wants to be heard. He wants to be able to fully express himself. He wants to stand before God, however terrifying that might be, and ask God, why? Why have you allowed this? Why have you taken all of my wealth? Why have you taken all of my kids? Why have you allowed my wife to forsake me? Why have you inflicted such physical pain and torment on me? Why? Job wants to be heard. He wanted an audience with God. He wanted someone to mediate between him and God so Job could be vindicated. But then we get to Job chapter 31, verse 40, the second half of verse 40. It says, the words of Job are ended. That's kind of an odd thing to add. We could have removed that sentence and the narrative of the story would have remained the same. But I think there's a specific reason why that part of the verse was added. See, we see this as a critical moment. There are two halves in the book of Job. Job chapter 1 to 31, Job chapter 32 to 42. Now the halves aren't equal, but we see transition that Job is done talking. He is done with his back and forth with his friends. He kind of left them in the dust a while ago. He stopped talking to them and just started talking to God. But we see that Job is done. He's expressed himself. Now, this does not mean that Job's questions are answered. It does not mean that Job has found some type of satisfactory reason that he can reconcile all this suffering. It means that Job is now silent. It means that Job has expressed himself fully. And he's at a place where he is now going to be still. He's done talking. He's done trying to justify himself. He's done trying to advocate for himself. Now, it's no sin to question God. It's not. Now, God does not tolerate entitlement. He doesn't tolerate arrogance. He doesn't welcome those things. But when we have questions, God can handle our questions. Job is done talking, but he desperately wants himself to be defended, which we all do. If you have been wronged, you want to be defended and you want to be vindicated. You want justice to happen. You want them. But the question that's really difficult for us to swallow is, why did God not answer Job? And the difficult reality is that Job was not ready to listen. As long as Job defends himself, God cannot defend Job. The longer I spend trying to defend myself, the more I push God away, so God can't be part of that equation. When the words of Job are ended, then our defender can rise before the court. See, Job was viewing it was him versus God. And actually, God is on Job's side. Job is trying to argue against God, where God is just telling him, be quiet so I can now speak. God is our defender. God is the one who's coming up and saying, Job, if you'll be quiet, I'll take over this court case and then you will be vindicated. But you're not going to be vindicated if you're the only one speaking. See, the reason I think the words of Job are ended, why that's added, is for this reality, is that the silence of God ends when ours begins. There's this concept that listen and silence have the same letters. That's not a concept, that's just a reality. We have cliches, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as much as you speak. But Job spent a lot of energy defending himself. And part of why he did that, he went on a journey. And this is the difference between, being still and being silent. Just being silent through suffering isn't always the best thing. Sometimes we need to fully express ourselves. Suppressing our emotions and what we're going through isn't what God calls us to do, but we come to a point where we need to be still and know that I'm God. And when we get to that point where we can be still, that's where the silence of God ends. Now, sometimes people butt in a little bit. We'll see the next 5 chapters. There's another person talking. Another friend who's been silent this whole time kind of jumps in. And only after that person's silent does God speak. But I don't know what you're going through right now. But we need to avoid the extremes. The extreme of suppressing everything and pretending like everything's okay when it's not. And the extreme of allowing the situation to consume you and control you and push Jesus out. Neither of those extremes are healthy. We need to fully express ourselves so we can go on this journey of processing, which is what Job is teaching us. We have to go through this journey. And once we go through that journey, then we are emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually ready for God to speak. We have to go through that. And that's really hard. Now, not in everything. You stub your toe, that's not a journey. I'm talking about these difficult things of life's questions where we don't always have the answers to. Where we get to a point where we've expressed ourselves, and then and only then can we be still and know that He is God. When we stop talking, that's when God has the opportunity to speak. So in the book of Job and in his journey, we see the silence of God ends where Job's begins.